I'm Ibiye Camp and I'm an artist based in London. And I work predominantly with exploring how technology kind of manifests from the environment and the landscape. Um, a lot of my work kind of is situated within West Africa, mainly in Freetown, Sierra Leone, and also in Nigeria. And this is I'm also kind of British Nigerian, so again I'm constantly kind of like also having conversations of identity within my work, and that's including kind of within trade, within infrastructure, within kind of supply chain. And yeah, I work with video, textiles, model making, and yeah, super happy to kind of hear from everyone today. So thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for being here. And PostboxGhana, if you want to introduce yourselves.
Yeah, I can go. Hello. So my name is Jiduna. I am a Master of Architecture student at MIT now. I am from Ghana. So yeah, currently based in the US, but presently I'm in Tanzania doing some research over the summer. Yeah, I think we added say like a preamble that kind of frames what we do as a group as part of our presentation. So I think yeah, this introduction is good for now, and then we'll get into it a bit more, like about what we do specifically. So I'll hand over to Manuela.
Thanks. Yes, it's Manuela here. I'm from Italy. I have a background in working with artists for contemporary arts and at a university in Milan with researchers that are interested in research with a high social impact. Specifically, we are now working within a prison to transform some of the spaces. And besides this, we Courage and Kantinka, a friend of ours who is based in Accra and is into like cultural organization, film and theater. We are putting together an archive of ephemera and postal material from Ghana's 50s, 60s, and 70s. And then, yeah, we will go into it a bit later.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, so we can begin. I think maybe we start with Ibiye, if she's happy to begin. So I think we'll run the two talks almost after each other, and then have a discussion after both.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I've prepared to speak about 3 projects with you today. As I mentioned previously, I'm an artist. I'm based in London, but I do spend part of my years kind of in Freetown in Sierra Leone, and that's kind of where a lot of my projects and explorations kind of come from, in working with scanning software and kind of the integrity of the scan and the life cycles of the scan. So I'm going to start with a project that I actually kind of realized at during my master's at the Royal College of Art in 2019. And this was a project titled Data, the New Black Gold. And this is kind of like where my practice kind of stemmed from. I was looking at data leakages and the kind of different types of governance that happened for private corporations when it came to a data leakage, and how that then was very different to the way that individuals and citizens were treated when there was a type of data leakage or a kind of redirection route of data exchange. And so what we're looking at on the screen here is on the left is a data leakage that's happening. This is kind of like the visual representation of a data leakage that was happening at a data center in Lekki. And on the right is a kind of a photogrammetry scan kind of police surveillance in the street. And I kind of started to explore various different ways that citizens could take restitution of their data, especially in a city like Lagos, where there's so many kind of like private corporations within the space, and also like a free zone that runs and kind of operates. And so I wanted to look into how people could start to collect data in the busiest areas of the city. And so that's where my experimentation came from within Data the New Black Gold. So it began in Lagos, but then it also kind of continued into exploring the busiest cities in Freetown and Sierra Leone. And what I found was that I wanted to search how I could capture kind of a moment of data exchange within the markets. So this is on Campbell Street in the center of Freetown. And this is a point of data exchange, in my view, because this is where people would update or top up their mobile credit. It's a space where you have to hand over your passport. In order to do so, you have to kind of like send money to the mobile company, and then they send it to you back. And so I decided to start to scan these points of data exchange. And from the scans, I started to find that the spaces where there were these mobile phone top-up stations, it kind of started to reveal certain types of compromises within the scan. So if you're familiar with 3D scanning, you often need to have like a still hand or to have like a tripod in order to kind of capture a scan in a particular way. Whereas the way that I was scanning with many kind of people moving through the space. So in this video that we're looking at now, it becomes a bit of a more of a trace of an area or an impression of an area. So through these various different steps of trying to explore restitution of people's data, and the idea of a data leakage, and the idea of how we can document citizens' kind of data exchange, and how people could start to use it for certain types of security use in their own right, I found that actually there are certain spaces that are almost unreadable with this type of photogrammetry software. And this made me kind of realize there are certain biases, because when kind of scanning a space that is kind of made in order to kind of like reflect the light, like kind of maybe spaces like St. Paul's Cathedral, or maybe certain types of marble sculptures, they capture the light and are able to be photogrammetried in a very effective way. Whereas the markets that I was using as my site were very contrasted in lighting, had many people walking through the spaces, and also what you find is that people actually are erased from the space because of movement, because they can't be kind of traced from frame to frame. And so this was a very interesting kind of visual language that I started to reveal. And so this turned into a kind of research film where I take the viewer through a market that is just kind of like an insight and into a little bit of the impression of the market. And I leave the sound within the piece so that you kind of get an impression of the vendors calling to customers, and you can kind of hear the footsteps shuffling through the market. So I'm just going to play a little bit of the film here. after I produced this film, I went back to Freetown, and actually I had started to make 3D models of the kind of top-up units which I had been analysing. And I have to say that a lot of the top-up units I was scanning, they were actually spaces that I would visit, like when I'm like there in Sierra Leone for the time that I'm living there. And so I wanted to return to show the vendors what I was actually doing. And so I showed them this model and photographed it within the space. And I found this really interesting, returning with an actual physical object, because these spaces are ephemeral. They are constantly changing, they are set up every day. And so returning with like something that is a kind of data capture of that particular moment in 2019 was very interesting, but I also found it very like Western of me to do so. I kind of felt like it was like kind of ornamentalizing this this moment, and I wonder how I can start to introduce certain types of qualities of time and life cycle into this model making and this representation. How can I kind of release the model from being kind of still in this state, when the actual reality of the space is that it's constantly changing, it's constantly moving and evolving, and different vendors are working there. So I'll take you on to another project which I created in 2019, which was the Sacred Forests of Ethiopia. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about the actual project, but I think what is fascinating about the project is, again, allowing the kind of process of model making to be determined by the software. So I was working in trying to show resistance of these spaces. If you don't know, there are these many, like maybe 800 kind of Orthodox churches which are based within the Nhama region in Ethiopia, and they are surrounded by these dense forests, whereas the rest of the landscape is very kind of farmed and very kind of cleared. And so these forests are resistant to deforestation because they are seen as heaven on earth. And so there's a kind of protection that happens. But the way that I was working within the forest, I was talking about how also, because of the movement that happens with the leaves in the forest, there's also a type of resistance to being kind of captured by technology. So I allowed my models to kind of work within Metashape in an extrapolated way, where the geometry was determined by the machine. So they started to kind of make enclaves and almost like bubbles around the models in this very kind of abstract way. And again, this is me trying to explore a certain type of determination of the software and reading these landscapes as resistant spaces. And I'm very interested in how these biases or how these languages are revealed through model making. So this is just a little insight into this project, which will kind of inform my next process, which was shown at the Venice Biennale. But this is the installation which was shown at the Sharjah Architecture Triennale back in 2019. And you can kind of see that some of the models are quite open, whereas some become more abstracted, some become more closed. And this was kind of using a type of plaster with the 3D printing. And this is like exactly the kind which was representing the digital space. And this was then kind of produced a physical model. So as you've probably seen in the Arsenale, I'm presenting a project which is called Rebellious Copies. And this is a project that I worked on this year. And it's a kind of reaction of the types of works that I've been creating for the past 4 years, where I am very interested in like how we reveal certain types of representations of space. I'm questioning kind of the ideas of pristine environments and like the way that we ornamentalize kind of data and the kind of pristine nature of data, and I want to question kind of resolution within spaces and how we see spaces. And so this is a kind of example of the exercise I was doing, where I wanted to revisit Freetown again with an idea about a even more reduced polygon of the model. So I started to kind of, with the model in the digital space of this market stall, I started to work in reducing the pixels and reducing the faces of the model and see what type of shapes I can make. And this is just a replica of an idea on the right of what this could look like. And then because the themes of this year's Biennale was kind of about, often about carbon, I was thinking, what if I start to introduce a live material into this process? And I don't want to kind of keep working with plaster and kind of things that aren't earthly kind of sediments. So I wanted to work with clay, because essentially, if I'm kind of thinking about life cycles of these 3D models, I want to start to think about the material that I use for this and how there's a life cycle with model making within architecture. So on the left here is a kind of example of the mobile phone top-up booth and how I'm trying to kind of start to reduce the polygons. And this is also like a kind of polygon count on the right as well, which is more speculative rather than exact. I was also in Freetown at the time when I was coming up with these concepts of why earthly sediments were important. And I kind of figured that a lot of model making within the African continent is with clay, is with types of kind of bronze and things like this. So I wanted to kind of like take on what I learned from the Letty Stewart Pottery Centre and kind of take this language into model making. So what I ended up doing for the Biennale was taking the OBJs, the documentation from Data the New Black Gold, and really starting to think about how I can introduce a life cycle to these objects. How can these objects, which they kind of don't exist anymore because they were taken in 2019, how can I kind of release my kind of architectural Western understanding of archiving or keeping documentation, and how can I start to think about the way that there could be a life cycle within these forms again, and maybe eventually I could delete them, or maybe I could introduce them back into the earth in some way. And so I started to experiment with how they could be 3D printed. And again, even to kind of do this process, it really kind of meant that I had to think about like if something would melt, or like how that form would be like translated into a kind of wet kind of substance, because clay, the way that it acts when it's in the 3D printer, it acts kind of very wet and kind of has a movement of its own. So I'm just going to show a couple of last things of how the process kind of like started to come into fruition. And again, I was working with reducing the polygons, but I was working with reducing the polygons, but there's also a new type of language to the form, a bit like in the Sacred Forest. They started to kind of, in the Sacred Forest project, they would become like enclaves and close off, whereas in this, they were wet, so they would start to droop, and then there would be like kind of further geometries that would be determined by the shape once introduced into physical form again. And so this was a very exciting process for me, because can I play this again? This was a very exciting process for me because, let's play this. This was a very exciting process for me because, again, I was thinking about digital files, but also I was trying to kind of speculate on what the reality is for these digital files and how they could be kind of put into a space where the geometry is determined not by the architectural kind of master designer kind of role. It's a you know, the material is deciding its form, the software is deciding its geometry and the kind of like limits of its geometry. And I really want to introduce this like unprecious way of working when it comes to material and when it comes to kind of representations of these very fluid spaces, these markets that really have a life of their own and don't kind of stay kind of pristine, they don't stay kind of as one. And I feel like this is the kind of language that I'm starting to kind of develop. So it came into this installation piece where, again, it was like a hybrid of model making and a 3D representation. And I'll just show you a couple more kind of clips. Again, the sound was also very important because the sound also kind of reveals the kind of movement of people within these spaces and the way that these are kind of not still moments. These are kind of moments in transition. And these are a couple more details, maybe. I feel like, yeah, you would have seen these pieces, but I wanted to kind of keep a study of these 7 objects in particular, which I presented. So you can see there's a digital kind of decay or kind of reduce of information that's happening. And there's also a physical kind of adaptation that is happening with the wetness that was this material.
Yes, we'll start our presentation with a prelude that is a conversation we have had several times among ourselves. Dear Courage, I was in my 30s when I met Ghana. You were in your zeros. I met it via Google Street View and images I searched online in preparation to visiting in person. Then continued to discover it through vintage postcards retrieved on eBay in a wistful wait to return during COVID. For me, it's longing. For you, it's belonging.
Growing up in Kumasi, in central Ghana, the image I was familiar with was the image of the built environment around me, one built mainly by draftsmen and masons. And that would often be described as semi-formal, slum-like, informal. I knew of those large buildings that existed in the city centers, those buildings that required a certain manner of behavior and dressing if you were to go visit them. And that's what often presented as what should be the desirable image of the city.
The Ghana I saw firsthand was definitely different from the image I had been fed with growing up in Italy. Have you also learned to see the city in new ways, even though you grew up in it?
As someone who trained in the visual arts and later in architecture, I was provided a lens to relook at the built environment that had always been around me, yet was in many ways overlooked, like how a person might overlook their nose, even though it is right in front of them. In doing so, I understood the built environment as fundamentally physical expressions of various aspirations and identities. It is with this understanding that I began to examine the imaging and image production histories of Ghana.
The learning exercise we ran together, PostboxGhana, is a collection of visual references from Ghana's collective memory, investigated through the aesthetic possibilities of material culture. We look at postal materials, an overlooked form of mass communication in the pre-internet era. This is an ecosystem connecting state, creatives, citizenry, and foreign countries that registered the construction on new state individual identity. It's the synergy among paper word, plus chemicals, plus human creativity, plus the politics of communication.
We look at architecture and its representation in media, and the role it has served in that thing called nation building, metaphorically and literally. Today, we will examine how image production and proliferation have been used to create alternative and opposite narratives, in the case of Ghana, to undo the colonial narrative and the colonial gaze.
And we'd like to start with the largest example of image heist we have gone through our material that actually happened on this tiny pictorial devices that are postal stamps. We see here the features of Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, that quite abruptly substituted the head of the Queen that had been on the stamps for the longest time. We propose that in this case of Ghana, and also more in large when a nation is liberated and people are faced with the need to question collective identity and as a consequence individual identity, sometimes it's not about producing new images, but rather using the existing one and finding an antidote to change the inherent narrative. In the words of Kwame Nkrumah itself, just after independence, many of my people cannot read or write. They've got to be shown that they are now really independent, and they can only be shown by signs. When they buy stamps, they will see my picture, an African like themselves, and they will say, ah, yeah, look, here is our leader on the stamps. We are truly free people. Another example of appropriation, if not like robbery of existing imagery, we tend to gravitate towards these stamps because of the overprint that so simply yet so powerfully determines the change of an era that was so vital for Ghana and for the world as a whole. When it comes to philately, things are complex because it's very tiny devices have large transnational implications. They are used as vessels for political messages. They were used in this case as part of the nation building efforts. Although the message is so strongly directed to Ghanaians, a lot of the time stamps were produced in the US and postcards were printed still in the UK. There's an interesting reference to a company misleadingly named a Ghana Philatelic Agency that won the bid to produce over 200 stamps under Kwame Nkrumah, and that was operating from New York City with 20-something designers, and none of them or almost was Ghanaian.
Okay, so with the periods of, with the colonial period and the post-colonial period, so after independence, we see a very massive shift in forms of representation. The image on the left is an image taken around 1910 when Ghana was it was the Gold Coast and still a British colony. The image on the right is coming from the years of 74 to 76 by a very popular photographer called James Barnor. On the left, I think we can all clearly see how it seems very orchestrated, and it's like you can almost see the photographer telling each and every one of them to sit in a certain way, to hold whatever stuff they're holding, wear whatever they're wearing. So the production of the image and the different types of gaze, we see a shift in that just by putting two images together. I think you can see the difference quite clearly. But I think it is also important to note that even though there is a shift, the element of orchestration still happens. I mean, today, even taking a picture of your friend, you will tell your friend, or pose a certain way, or pose that type of way. But I think the biggest difference in these two forms of image production is essentially what those images are being used for, or what kind of narrative they are enforcing. So on the left, this image served, a very big role in perpetuating the ideas of African peoples as uncivilized, as savage, as primitive, all these ideas that I think we all know very well, and that in many ways still proliferate today. Images like this played a very huge role in proliferating those notions and ideas. Whereas images on the right started to celebrate the uniqueness of an individual. You have this bare-chested man, singing on the streets with these kids looking up to him, thinking, oh yeah, maybe I want to be like him someday. Next slide. Also, the proliferation of the colonial gaze is something that didn't necessarily happen on the shores of Ghana. So the source for the images was in Africa, in Ghana, and several other colonies, of course. But in most of those productions, the audience was meant to be a different group of people who, in most cases, had never visited, the places where these images were taken from. And the British Empire exhibition in 1924 is a very vivid and like quite powerful form of image making that serves a certain function. So in this example, in Wembley in 1924, the British Empire wanted to basically make a show of power. And to do that, the most effective way was to basically show how many different regions around the world we've been able to subjugate and colonize. And in this case, it wasn't just about producing a two-dimensional image. It really was a three-dimensional image. And it is a lot more powerful than, just showing something on a postcard, which is in your hand. Imagine building an image of what Africa is, or, the Gold Coast is, and literally entering it, seeing the various artifacts and, reinforcing those ideas. There are things that these kinds of exhibits do to the brain. And I think it's also important to note that these kinds of exhibitions didn't happen in just the UK. We have it in Chicago, in Paris, various world fairs. And with all of them, there is always a certain subjugation of a group of people. I think, even the Venice Biennale and even the idea of national pavilions, here you can see the East African Gold Coast buildings on the right are in some sense national pavilions. But as to what narrative it is perpetuating, I think, yes, there is like several questions there to explore. Next one. So with independence in 1957, the country's first president, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, was someone who understood this idea of making an image. And I think we know this from what Manuela read earlier about, putting my face there, an African's face. So people will think that, yes, an African can also, lead a nation or a country. And for him, I think he also understood the power of architecture and building as that thing that could make a certain image in a very concrete form. And, these are like concrete, literally concrete limestone buildings that stay in the environment, like they stay with us for a very, very long time. So like freezing an image that withstands climate, withstands a whole lot of things and carries this idea into, perpetuity, into like very long periods of time. I think this is something that Kwame Nkrumah understood very well. So on the left, we have the Independence Arch, and this is not a new form. We have several forms like this, and I'm sure you all like recognize, this kind of rectangular archway gate in several cities in Europe. But here it is topped with the Black Star, which in many ways is an anti-image to the White Star. So just a brief history about, this Black Star, White Star, Yellow Star thing. So in the early 20th century, there was a White Star shipping line, which actually included the most famous ship, the Titanic. So Marcus Garvey, who was this big freedom actor in the United States at the time, decided to create a shipping line which was for just Black people. He called it a Black Star shipping line. And then this would then translate into, like, it would become the inspiration for Nkrumah's choosing this as a symbol to represent the freedom of all Black people around the world, and particularly all African states. So yeah, here we see a very like clear anti-imaging of a certain colonial image that already existed. The image on the right, the Ghana House, represents another one of these modernist structures that were built after independence. But here it is not to signify a certain moment in time, independence. It is to actually perform a certain function, and it was a trade building. So Leventis was a Greek trader who came to Ghana, traded a lot, helped with actually developing the economy of Ghana from a very young age, like right from independence. So yeah, so we see function, we see like just pure symbology, but they're all contributing to creating this image, which for a long time had been colonial. Now it's like a modern new country. Yeah. Next slide. And so in creating the image in physical three-dimensional forms, I think Nkrumah and his government also really understood the power of producing photographs of those buildings. So yeah, you've built the image, right? You've built a three-dimensional thing that is there, that people can walk around. But how else, like, what are the other ways you can further that image? It literally is to take a picture of it, put it on a postcard, send it around the world. And that literally becomes, a tool for showing, you know, people in Europe or like different groups that, hey, look, we are an independent country. These are some of the things that we built. So your former postcards that, you know, show us as a primitive colonial people no longer hold true because, hey, look, we are doing this. So there's a certain propaganda and a state agenda that is being fed, not by the image itself, but by a reproduction of the image in the forms of postcards, photographs. So yeah, in many ways, you can think of it as Instagram, right? Like, what do you do when you visit a new place? You take a picture of it, put it out there so people can see. So it's very much the same thing that is happening here, but it is to further this image of Ghana as a new country, a modern country that is capable of governing itself.
And going on with this extraction from our archive, we selected some symbolic images to show you. We would like to focus also on the emancipatory reuse of these colonial buildings. The one on the left was once an administrative British office that for a short time became the Parliament House in Accra. And on the right, similarly, another colonial building that became to be, according to our material, the Premier's office. We suggest that very similarly to what happened with the Gold Coast postal stamps, this was an overprint of function. So what was decided was to preserve the form and to change the content in order to give a completely new meaning. That's why we consider like this reproduction of these new functions as anti-image to what was happening for decades before. Other examples are the celebration of communication and exchange of even people and movements within the city. So what we observe are two functional infrastructure that were newly built. There is a building that the postal and telecommunication headquarters functional to conveying the new political paradigm. So it's a physical embodiment of all the new connection of the entire country. So everything that was post telegraph, telephone, and video was going through this specific building built in this modern form. And on the right, we are at Nkrumah Circle. That is one of the main interlinks within Accra. It's a huge roundabout that, as the building on the left conveys messages and information, this interlinks is pivotal in creating connections within the city and circulating people and goods. And finally, two images that show how the promotion of state agenda was being proposed not only through the construction of new building in itself, but also through their advertisement, and how like media was basically part of the new architecture. There's a lot of politics around what was shown on the state-produced postcards and what was not. Here we see a bank, the Bank of Ghana, National Bank, a beautiful modernist building. And then the Meridian Hotel in Tema, that was a state hotel, very much advertised, and that became the symbol of modernity, tourism and leisure within this new country that entered a new phase, like past the struggle, became also a place for enjoyment. You can notice that none of these were printed in Ghana, like ironically one was printed in Italy, and we are in the 60s. But what we would like to focus on is the presence of certain intervention and certain novelty in postcard as opposed to what was not featured.
So yeah, just leading off of that as to what was and was not featured. Yeah, I had a conversation with Manuela today, and yeah, I was I said something that was like a realization for myself that it's about less than 1% of all buildings or all construction in Ghana is, you know, these socialist modernist ones. They really are few compared to what people build on a day-to-day. And so then the question that then there's a natural question almost of, okay, so then why then is the majority of like all kinds of construction not represented in the same way? I guess, yeah, it did not fit what was modern, or did not fit what was meant to be the image of the city. And yeah, of course, there's no way an image of like the image we're seeing on our screens now would get represented. This is a typology called the blue kiosk. It's a very popular structure and term within Ghana growing up. It's like, yeah, people give directions. Okay, you're going here, there's a blue kiosk, you know, on that junction there, take a left after the blue kiosk. It's such a colloquial term, and it's with us in every day that it contributes to part of, you know, the image of the city. It lives in our collective memories. But as to whether it is represented as that or not, usually not. There are several terms that, you know, are associated with structures like this. Yeah, you find this in slums or informal settlements, and there's always interventions to try to formalize them or to demolish them and beautify them. There's different kinds of phrases and terms associated with structures like this. But just by virtue of them being majority of everything that is built in Ghana, I think, yes, they do contribute like a very significant amount as to what image the city becomes. So once you arrive in Ghana, you realize, yeah, it is not just the modernist buildings, it is several of these ones. We have been following some visual storytellers today that have increasingly been paying attention to these often ignored spaces. These two photographs are by a visual storyteller called Alassane Fatau. He has an Instagram account called Old Fadama Retold, where he basically goes into these places and then captures them. And just by representing them, I think we're able to see that, okay, these are actually active sites of expression. People live here in a day-to-day. And so we, after, you know, having these conversations, we decided to, you know, think about it more and see what people's takes were on it, especially academics. Is this something that is spoken about in schools? Is it part of the mainstream media? And in the next slide. Yeah, we came across this reading from Achille Mbembe and his wife Sarah Nuta from 2004, where they were basically trying to defamiliarize, you know, these commonplace readings of Africa. So an image like the ones we've just seen, yeah, I think it does travel off the shores of Africa. It's just thought of as, you know, oh, this is what we mean by the underdeveloped Africa. So Mbembe and Nuttall basically were arguing for a rereading of these spaces or even these images and what it might mean to consider them as part of, you know, the image of the city and not just something that needed to be rehabilitated. So yeah, an extract from their reading goes, nevertheless, in our rendering of Johannesburg, we depart from the global city paradigm, if only because of its economicism and the poverty of its understanding of cityness. Indeed, a city is not simply a string of infrastructures, technologies, and legal entities, however networked these are. It also comprises actual people, images, and architectural forms, footprints, and memories. The city is a place of manifold rhythms, a world of sounds, private freedom, pleasures, and sensations. Yeah, and just this last statement, I think we can all agree that this is something that has not been actively captured on the postcards. You know, it's still very, let's frame this modernist building. Let's capture it at a time when there aren't so many people walking around, because we want to capture the grandeur of it and, you know, provide this elevated sense of this structure that is with us but not of us. Yeah, I think Mbembe and Nuttall are arguing the opposite, that actually the city is a much more complex place, that it has pluralities. There's several things that are going on that we can't ever capture in a single photograph. And so our last slide is as basically just giving examples of people's work that we like. So these are all Instagram handles of people that we think are starting to produce images and share images that for a very long time have been a different type of way. So these are people that are going into the liminal spaces, the informal spaces, and actually capturing them. And yeah, in many ways, it is due to a certain free platform, you know, called Instagram, which is very easy and it's free. You just capture something, put it there. But since the rise of Instagram and its popularity, it's become its own archive, and a lot of the work that we do is actually using the same space and creating engagement there. So we decided to kind of show this as like today's ways of making the image of the city and what's like happening. Yeah, thank you. This is
Thank you so much. Thanks, Manuela and Courage. That was amazing. Yeah, I guess to open it up to the participants, if you have any questions for Ibiye or
I just wanted to ask Ibiye what programs you use to scan parts of Freetown?
yes.
Freetown,
Yeah.
people are moving.
Yeah, I was using Metashape, Agasoft Metashape, which is kind of like it's quite an exciting mapping software. So it can show you so you take photographs, but you can also when you upload the photographs, with Agasoft it can like show the points, the GPS of exactly where you have photographed, so you can almost see like the trail and the movement that you do through, whether it's a straight road, whether you are kind of orbiting an object, or Ariel Kane is an amazing artist who actually was my tutor when I was at the Royal College of Art, and Ariel used a kite to photograph a site using a kite, and so this was like flying through the air. So it's really exciting that you can actually see where each individual photograph is taken, and then that forms the object. And so yeah, it's Agasoft Metashape that I used.
Can you explain more about the object that you choose to explore more? Were they like where you put on your mobile, the menu on your mobile, and why specifically did you choose those objects to examine?
For the project in Data the New Black Gold, I was trying to find points of data exchange. So it was within the markets, and I wanted it to be particularly because it was in response to research that was looking into the free zone in Lekki in Lagos in Nigeria. And so these are spaces where private corporations from overseas are like setting up. And so I was really looking for spaces that were kind of citizen run, spaces that also were ephemeral in some sort of manner, like spaces that weren't necessarily a kind of concrete building. So they often were like kind of underneath an umbrella or set up with kind of a kind of containers, or even the one of the examples that I showed was in a omoleke, which is like a trolley which people can put in fruits and things. So I was looking for things that are in transition and things that are in movement, and that was for the project, the initial project which I presented, which was in 2019. And then from that, my process for rebellious copies was slightly different, because I was revisiting the scans which I created, where I was trying to like kind of show these kind of like unique kind of citizen-run moments of data. Whereas for rebellious copies, I wanted to find various different scenes to kind of introduce a life cycle to, but then obviously the integrity of the model became important. So I kind of needed models that had a solid base so that they could be printed, and not kind of, I needed something that wasn't going to be a pile of clay. And so there was a little bit of control and that had to be introduced. But I would love to go back into the project and again not have this mentality of trying to have like a particular type of outcome, because with my projects, I don't edit my models at all. Like I I keep the models as they have been documented, and I keep my models like as they are revealed by the 3D printer. And so so there was a selection process of what could be printable for this particular project, and it was these 7, which was you know, certain elements were like the traders in the markets, and certain moments were like the actual kind of scan of the whole street. So the individuals were quite readable, whereas the kind of scenes of the street were very abstract. So I hope that kind of explains kind of what my process was, but I was trying to, like, again, not to have a complete control over what the outcome would be.
Hi, can you elaborate more on the idea of data leakage? Because I kind of didn't understand. Like, is it data that were captured but were processed, or not captured, or just automatically discarded?
So the project began with trying to kind of articulate this new kind of data harvesting which happens in big cities like Lagos. So they are very desirable spaces for people to go and set up businesses. And because I think the population when I was doing my research was like 19 million or something. It was like that were within Lagos. So it was just a huge amount of people that were kind of going through. And so it's the most populated city within West Africa. And so you know, it becomes a space of immense kind of equity, and you know, a space where free zones would operate. And so with the data leakage, this is coming from a data center. So there was a data center that is operating, which works for the overseas corporations which have set up in Lekki within the free zone. And there was a reported data leak that happened where customers' data was rerouted to a Chinese corporation. And this kind of, so at the beginning, when I showed this study, this was an example of what a data leakage happens, what a data leakage looks like in a corporate sense. And then with I started to kind of try to explore a data leakage in a sense of not being able to control kind of the way that a form is recognized. And a data leakage is when, you know, information is rerouted. And so these were the 2 representations that kind of began the project, in talking about kind of private corporations, and in speaking about the way that language is read by certain types of technology that have come from a particular data pool in the West, and how we kind of read forms, and how certain information kind of bleeds into the next. And so it is a very kind of abstract way of working, but it was kind of a response of looking at these various different infrastructures which are being put in place and aren't taking consideration for the fluid kind of nature of the city. I hope that explains a little bit.
Now, if I may also, Sarah just mentioned that I feel very inspired by Ibiye work. And
oh, thank you so much.
It's like, besides being like visually like stunning, it really like recalls some conversation that we have with an artist friend of ours around the idea, like, is it possible to archive a city? Like, how do we do it? And like this translation that you do into archiving something that is immaterial, I find it very interesting. And also your sense of responsibility, like your question, like, then what do I do with this? Like, how do I secure that it has a lifetime, a life cycle? Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, your presentation was amazing as well. I feel like, yeah, we have a lot of overlapping, so it's a nice grouping. Sure.
Yeah, for us, it was really amazing to see the 2 presentations together, especially because they like kind of bring out different elements of the brief that we're working on. And I think also just looking at 2 different ways to produce like images. So like the the kind of the nationally sanctioned images on stamps and postcards, and then how those kind of, I mean, I really loved how the two of you spoke about the anti-image and like the many ways in which that it gets created. And also when you're speaking about the kind of presence and absence in politics. And then I think in contrast, Ibiye, when you were talking about like the way you've been making your own kind of images or objects of these kind of transient or temporal spaces that are quite hard to image. That was really fascinating as well in terms of like how you balance between the life of the space. And I really like that you captured the sounds as well. And then the kind of object itself as an artifact. And I guess maybe as a question to all of you, it would be really interesting to hear a bit more about where you feel you're limited by the imaging techniques that you're kind of engaging with in each of your practices.
Like, I'm not sure I heard your question correctly, but from what I hear, I want to say that I think that we are all here talking about like Africa is an idea at the end of the day. Like, even if we start from like archives, like we tend to use archive from the 60s and set up a situation with them and let it unfold in the present. And Ibiye, I feel she's like even creating her own archive like today that will serve the future, because it's such a like big endeavor, the one of rethinking like subaltern realities and urbanism. I think what we do is to really abstract reality to an idea. So probably trying and make sense, not by creating images that make sense in a way, but like the more translated into languages and the more abstract it is, the more is close to reality.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sounds really, it's like a really lovely way of putting it, and to compare the two in terms of the creation or engagement with different forms of archive. I guess my question was like where you feel like the image hasn't been able to capture the idea that you're talking about, and where you might have to, like I really loved how in the beginning you introduced the project through text and through both of you reading the text. And I was just wondering if there are moments when you're working with these archives and like trying to intervene with them that you have to use things that aren't images.
Yeah, I can say something to that. So first of all, I think for me, the biggest loss is always when in taking the image, there's an act of translation. That's along that translation, there's some information lost. And if it's a photograph, it's like freezing a certain moment in time, which is super misleading because like, yeah, it's like a collapse of so many things, and so many things gets ignored, you know. I guess a video does that a lot more as a collection of images or a motion picture. But yeah, definitely there is something that is lost in that translation. So the question then becomes like, how do you represent that image that you've taken to basically try to be as close to the facts or the truth as possible, but you can never, capture the whole truth in itself. Yeah, because even with the physical three-dimensional image, it's not so objective as to try to capture it and tell an objective truth about it. So yeah, I guess in many ways, for us, the way we practice is more about coming to terms with what is lost in that, but also using abstraction, like Manuela was saying, to hopefully try to tell a certain story and not try to tell the whole story. Yeah.
And I also want to propose that like images are like not neutral at all. Like even the viewpoint distorts the image, like currently one image, like if you see it like this or like this, already changes it. And we talk a lot among ourselves about seeing the same thing differently, like from an internal point of view, from my external gaze. There's a lot to be told around the non-objectivity of image. I think that is the limit, but also the potential in it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that when you're speaking about kind of leaning into like the abstraction, it kind of leaves space for people to kind of interpret a scene. So I feel as though I find the limitations of the image very interesting, and then when that's met with sound or when that's met with smell or something, you know, it kind of allows you to kind of you know, allow your experiences, allow kind of nostalgia to come into the piece. I showed my piece Data the New Black Gold a couple times before, and sometimes people, you know, that kind of grew up in Lebanon, you know, recognize like the way that there's like certain types of typologies in the landscape that kind of makes them think that it's from a city that they grew up in or something. And I think this is idea of being able to just have a trace of the scene is really exciting, and I think it kind of reveals a little bit more of just having this abstract representation. So the limits are very powerful because it also hides one's identity, but also kind of reveals certain types of things that maybe words can't. Yeah, I find that quite fascinating.
Yeah, I did want to add one last thing that I think in working just through our work with archives and the understanding that we cannot present the archive in a completely objective manner, but through an act of representation of the archive, which speaks to some of the images you probably saw with our piece in the Biennale. Through a representation of it, we are able to make new associations and create new stories from the archive. So it's not just a working in the past kind of thing, but yeah, using what has been in the past and using the technique of abstraction to then create certain associations. So whether it's a poster of, you know, a job advertisement, you know, superimposed with an image of a worker from the 1950s, you know, like what does that collage mean today? I think, yeah, there's a certain looking forward that these archives are very powerful at when we start to, you know, work on them with techniques of abstraction and representation. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Does anyone have any further questions? Come back.
I have a question on the kind of the medium that you all choose and the way this kind of new technology of 3D printing and photogrammetry would capture kind of a complexity of non-Western cities that our kind of image doesn't really reflect in a way, or it will have to be abstracted to be understood and fixed. But on the other hand, the abstraction of the photogrammetry for me kind of loses like the fragmentation that is nice to be shown for the first time with a new medium. So you have cities that have been in flow for a lot of time, but then we have the technology to do that now with 3D printing and photogrammetry and this kind of I don't know, like dream kind of escapes. It's not really, it's kind of hazy image that is 3D, like in 3D dimension, which again, like, why would you abstract it to something that is very reductive to a form? I don't know if this is clear.
Sorry, it was breaking up a little bit when you were speaking, but I think I understand that you were saying like why embrace this abstract nature when it kind of you know, kind of retracts kind of certain information.
Yeah, like when you have a lot of information in the photogrammetry itself, and it's kind of directly translated to the 3D printed model with this kind of escapes, and then you reduce the polygons, make it more abstract.
Yeah, like I think that it's more, I'm not trying to so I'm using the software in like a kind of very fluid way to kind of talk about movement, talk about pace, talk about speed of a city. And the way that I see it is that this software actually doesn't really provide actual kind of like understanding of the city, because you have to kind of be able to move through it in a particular type of way. You know, there, when you kind of like scan a street, there will be people walking, kekes moving up and down, and it won't document that. And so I think this like kind of lack of information also is providing information. I feel like there's like information within that misunderstanding and between that void. And so I'm not trying to kind of like you know, fake these glitches and these like errors or these kind of absent moments. I feel as though that is an additional kind of amount of information of the kind of integrity of these scans and the way that they were taken. And so I think that it's really interesting, the question, and I kind of feel as though like that lack of information is an extra line of information and a space to design within, and a space to kind of maybe rethink a type of technology that can like read these spaces. And that's why kind of when it's met with sound, it also reveals that movement that's happening, that we're missing. And I think it's really fascinating as well, because like you said, you know, there are all these amazing technologies that anyone can like access now of 3D scanning, but I'm also like questioning that pristine digital language, because the digital and the whole kind of totality and completeness and everything being resolved in a game space also has a lot of Western connotations to it in that visual language. Like, why do we want to do things in such a high resolution? Like, kind of like, what does it mean to kind of like have these like kind of multiple kind of polygon details? And I think I want us to continue to question this, and not just to kind of accept the technology as it's been given to us. I think we should start to interrogate it and look at what is missing and why it's missing, and make a project from that, or kind of continue to design with that void and design within the void in some sort of way. I hope that becomes clear, or is clear.
Yeah. I think it's, I mean, I think it's a really fascinating, you know, a much bigger topic, I think, to look at. And it's a kind of, I think in the PostboxGhana project, you were talking a bit toward the end about the kind of politics of presence and absence in media. And I think that's a nice thing as well into what you were just saying, Ibiye, about like sometimes what's absent is more telling than what's present. Anyone else? It's really great. Yeah. Thank you. It's come at like a brilliant time for us. Everyone is working through their own projects. So thank you for being so generous in sharing, yeah, your thoughts around image and your own practices, which are also just super fascinating. And I think everyone here really enjoyed. And giving us lots of ideas of like how to both work with the past and the present to construct these like alternate realities, or kind of new ways of seeing these spaces and ideas.
Yeah. May I ask how you came up with the image heist topic for your unit? Whose idea was that?
It was I don't know. It came after a long but short discussion. But yeah, I think we're both really fascinated in cities and how cities are made, and also I think around identity. So I think Manijeh's experience in National Pavilion curation, I think definitely also just framed our thinking around how the Venice Biennale and how it's situated, and also becomes an icon and an image for many other places. Was super fascinating, but also I think we both come from really interesting cities, both of us, but also all of our participants. And I think it's been really interesting to kind of think through technology, social media, and I think how the project of colonization has moved through all these different technologies, from the lo-fi to the high res, and how fast it's moved as technology has become more and more sophisticated. So yeah, it was somewhere between there. I think it's just kind of like fascinations that are on our minds.
Yeah, we also thought being in Venice as a city that's been imaged so much, but also has so much of Venice has been designed with other places in mind, and vice versa. And then the Biennale as well has all these images from everywhere. But then again, it goes back to this thing of like what's not here as well, and that's like the kind of project that the participants are all working on at the moment in terms of how would they question national identity, how would they question the imagery that is here and what isn't, in what they're currently working on. So yeah, as Sarah said, this was perfectly timed to help us think through that. And yeah, I guess like it's always the case when you write a brief that you never know where it will go. And it's been really exciting, even in the last just a week and a half that the college has been running, to see like all the many ways everyone has taken on the brief and this idea of the heist as an act in terms of like how we transform not just imagery, but maybe question our reliance on imagery, like in architecture, as like we always think of it as like a very visual culture, but we're trying to also think of other ways to like perform or describe or inhabit the city that isn't so reliant on images. Yeah, it's been really amazing to have you here with us virtually. Thank you all so much for making the time.
Thank you. Thanks from all of us.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah, give you a clap.
It was great to engage in the conversation.
Yeah.
Hopefully see you all again soon.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.